Florida was a reliably Democratic state in the mid-20th century, but the Democratic Party was a hodgepodge of different factions then, and cracks began to emerge. In part 2 of our series, Red, Purple, and Blue, A Sea Change in Florida Politics, we look at the conservative Democrat who switched parties to challenge the Democratic governor who supported racial justice, and Florida in the 80s being led by the man who may have picked fruit for your parents. When Democratic Governor Reuben Askew ran for re-election in 1974, Republicans ran Jerry Thomas, a former Democrat and Senate president. Thomas said he left the party due to Askew's pro-busing, anti-business, and radical environmentalist leadership. At this point, Republicans attacked Democrats as being liberal to tie them to excessive government and the perceived moral decay of the 1960s. The strategy didn't work in 1974. Askew was easily reelected with 61% of the vote. He then nominated to the Florida Supreme Court the first black justice, Joseph Woodrow Hatchett. By the time Askew left office, he built a national profile with Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter for racial reform. Democrats had supermajorities by the time he left. However, Republicans were building their own infrastructure.
The Republican Party really started working on candidates. Really, the base of it started up in Pinellas County and Hillsborough County. And as that effort expanded, it came down to Sarasota, Charlotte, Collier, Lee, and it really built, into the early 90s. They called it the Golden Horseshoe because it went from Collier up over to Orlando and down. And so that was the Republican base for the whole state.
This was part of a long-term effort for them because they wouldn't even sniff the governor's mansion in 1978. Democrat Bob Graham was a state senator and became well known for his Workdays program. He started it in 1974 to introduce himself to voters. He would spend a day working as a bellboy in Orlando, a ring announcer in Tampa, a waiter in Jacksonville, a tomato picker in Naples, a factory worker in Bradenton, or Santa Claus visiting Coral Gables. He won the 1978 gubernatorial election by more than 11 points. Graham focused on economic development and driving tourism investment. He also brought more environmentally endangered lands into public ownership than any other state. In 1982, he was re-elected in a landslide 65 to 35%. The only big county the Republican won? Sarasota. At this point in time, plenty of elderly Floridians voted Democratic, partly because of their life back up north before moving to Florida.
They grew up in the unions, right? So people that were retire age in the 80s and 90s, a lot of them worked in kind of middle-class union shops, and they were able to build themselves to that middle-class plus socioeconomic status. Having been a union shop, connections to Democrats, all those sorts of things.
Despite 4 straight Democratic wins, you had rising crime, property taxes, and deteriorating schools that were driving Floridians to the suburbs, and they began looking to Republicans for answers.
We started seeing that we were losing the blue dog Democrats. They were starting to register as Republicans.
Conservative Democrats for years had elected, sort of Southern conservative Democrat or type governors in Florida, or people who at least had some appeal to those folks. And then maybe they were voting for Reagan for president.
Ronald Reagan's presidential election in 1980 did usher the Reagan Revolution, with huge tax breaks for the rich and a strong anti-communist message. He was more supportive of blockades against Cuban President Fidel Castro than Reagan's predecessor, Jimmy Carter.
Because we saw the influx coming from Cuba, the influx coming in from the Latin Americas, we started seeing more and more people coming down to our state to retire.
And with so many people moving to Florida, there was no cultural identity in the state. You would identify yourself from where in Florida you were. You were on the Nassau Coast, the Suncoast, North Florida, the Panhandle, South Florida, Central Florida. Transplants subscribed to hometown newspapers in their old state. There were no union company barbecues and labor rallies as Midwesterners enjoyed up north, so newcomers turned to churches for community. A strong, vibrant Jewish community grew in Florida, especially Southeast Florida. However, megachurches became big, and abortion politics united megachurches with the Catholic Church. In the meantime, Governor Graham ran for Senate at the end of his second term and won the 1986 U.S. Senate election in Florida. While he was a popular governor in a way that masked problems with the state Democratic Party, Democrats had little party structure for young, up-and-coming Democrats running for office. Republican Bob Martinez ran for governor in 1986. He was Tampa's mayor and a Democrat before 1983. In fact, not only was he a former Democrat, but he got the endorsement of James Smith, who lost his Democratic gubernatorial primary also in 1986, switched parties, and ran as a Republican for Florida Secretary of State. 1986 was shaping up to be a rough election year for Florida Democrats. The year would be rough, but one crucial issue would derail the next governor's term, and a future presidential candidate moved to Florida and gave the Democrats one of their most competitive races post-World War II. That's in the next edition of Red, Purple, and Blue, a sea change in Florida politics. You can catch it every Sunday at 6 and 10 p.m., and you can find all episodes so far on the Politics tab on our website, snntv.com.